Hey guys, it's Walk, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about Premodern, going to be talking about the solution, going to be talking about some really cool stuff. This is a pretty neat deck. It's been around for quite some time. Obviously, definitely one of the more sort of obvious decks to make, just like put all the good cards together kind of thing. So let's go ahead and let's get started talking about the solution. Now you're probably wondering, what does that even mean? Why was it called the solution? Uh, Again, some of these names are old school, sort of inherited names. For example, this one, the solution, came from an invasion block constructed deck created by Zvi Moshowitz, and it was the solution to the block constructed metagame. At the time, it was blue-white. It played like Voice of All and Galena's Knight because there was such a heavy red presence due to things like Flametongue Kavu, which was, of course, pretty ridiculous back in the day, more so than even what we would imagine today. But pretty sweet stuff, pretty sweet stuff. So that was where the genesis of that name came from. So that's pretty neat, pretty cool. There's also a Type 2 deck in Invasion Odyssey standard called Star Spangled Slaughter. Again, also a red, white, and or this one was a red, white, and blue deck, which is certainly more in line with what we are playing or going to be talking about today, where the solution was just purely a blue-white deck. So yeah, and a lot of the cards that we're playing or looking to play, specifically Lightning Angel, which is such a sweet card. Pretty good stats on it. You know, hard to burn out. You can't smother it. So that's pretty sweet. 4 mana, 3/4 flying, haste, vigilance. Pretty good. You can't really go wrong. And of course, it has that sweet arcade post artwork. I don't know. There's something about a lot of these crazy cards from Apocalypse, like all the different multicolored stuff, like, what was it? Fungal Shambler? Yeah, that's like the blue, black, green big thing that like dealt damage and like they discard and you drew, like those kind of silly things. Like the art is so cool, it just like makes you want to play them, even if they're like really not that great or whatever. But Lightning Angel is actually a legitimately good card and a pretty good reason to want to play the deck. Because it's great blocker, of course, right? Pretty much always going to get a 2-for-1 if you're blocking weenie stuff. It can fly over things like walls or other blockers, things like that. So that's pretty sweet, pretty sweet. And of course, like I said earlier, is a typical multicolored aggro control deck in pre-modern, or just in a lot of other formats where it's just what's the best creatures that we can use to beat down that are efficient, as well as like what are the best like removal spells in these colors. Card advance stuff, like what's the best stuff we can play. And there's a bunch. We'll be talking about those. And it's a very customizable deck. Again, this is sort of like, always need to preface this, like pre-modern, there's a lot of brewing, there's a lot of people just throwing random stuff against the wall, playing janky stuff, so it's not like there's a really a set metagame anywhere, especially because there's people playing from all over the world, and everyone has different things they like to do and whatnot, so there's a lot of customization that you can do if you're expecting certain things, but it's hard to know what to expect because it's so random. It's so random. So there you go. Okay. So first off, this is what I like. Basically, most of this is pretty much set in stone. I think the Lightning Angels, Meddling Mages, Exalted Angels, pretty cool stuff. Again, Mana Leak Swords, Bolt. This is all basically stock, right? You're not going to be leaving home without these. Again, if we're looking at the mana base, it's going to be hard to cast something like Counterspell, so that's why we got Mana Leak and so on. Prohibit is additional counter magic. Disenchant to answer artifacts and enchantments that slip through. Fire Ice is sort of like a all-around decent removal spell. Again, can be card advantage against weenie decks, say something like Sly or Elves or whatnot, or even some builds of mono black. Yeah, and it's never dead, and it cantrips, or it can deal to, or it can tap stuff. I mean, does a lot. So that's pretty sweet, pretty sweet. You got some cantrips, and of course the mana base is going to be very difficult to sort of make all this stuff work. So yeah, we're definitely going to be playing heavy on the multicolor lands, so things like City of Brass, Undiscovered Paradise produce all three colors of mana. Some pain lands, the one fetch land that's playable in these colors, and of course some basics. So yeah, there you go. This is, I don't want to say this is a stock mana base or anything, but this is typically the kind of stuff you'll see. Gemstone Mine's another consideration that you can play, but if it's it's good and it's bad. Obviously, like you can tap it a couple times for mana of any color, just immediately, not having to worry about it dealing you a bunch of damage. But of course, it does end up going away, which can make it difficult to cast more expensive spells, namely the Exalted Angel, even sometimes the Lightning Angel. And of course, sideboard has all sorts of stuff that you're going to expect. You have Red Blast and Blue Blast, which are of course probably the most important cards to be playing, just because they're so very good at doing what they do, which is being one mana super vindicates. And of course, Annul, people probably like, why not play more Disenchant or something? Because the main color is blue, right? You really want to have your, especially because the counter magic itself, of course, is very time sensitive, right? If you don't, if you draw your mana leak after they resolve their threat, well, tough luck, right? Pretty obvious, right? So you're going to want blue mana early, and of course, Annul plays into that very well. And of course, the second reason is that there are some enchantments and or artifacts you don't want to resolve, or they already do their damage after they resolve. So think of something like Recurring Nightmare out of the Rock or whatever other sort of mid-range style of deck, or something like Defense Grid out of, say, combo decks like the Devour combo deck, or of course even Devourer itself. So there's a lot of different reasons why you would play Annul, and of course Annul just being one mana is pretty huge too. Things like Pyroclasm against the weenie decks, especially when there's a lot of redundancy or whatever, you'll swap out the Melee Mages for Pyroclasm, because Pyroclasm is very good at wiping up weenie swarms. So very sweet there. And of course, Melee Mage just doesn't do much versus those kinds of decks. Crypt for graveyard hate. Of course, this may or may not want to be something like Phyrexian Furnace, depends on the situation, but Crypt is just no muss, no fuss, super cheap, super free. Hibernation, great against survival-based decks, other just green decks in general. Cursed Totem, of course, against all sorts of different things. So yeah, lots of different things. And of course, Armageddon I like against the aggro control, excuse me. I like Armageddon best against the mid-range and control decks. I think that's a pretty big, powerful haymaker. And I would like to play another one. So this is kind of tentative, that you can play a little bit less, a little bit more stuff. Maybe you don't actually need the crypts. There's very little. There's not a lot of graveyard stuff. There is stuff like, for example, Full English Breakfast, which does use the graveyard, but a lot of graveyard stuff is kind of a fringe. So Reanimator, the Hermit Druid decks, and stuff like that. At least from what I've seen when I've been looking at recently. So, anyways, yeah. So that again, you can shape it to whatever you expect, but this is like just a decent sort of starting kind of sideboard. All right, and now we are going to be talking about Portent and Impulse. Of course, these are cantrips, and these are not always played, which I think is a little strange. Portent is very, very good. I mean, what else do you want to say? It's most of a ponder, So yeah, this should probably always be played. It's an excellent play on turn one. There's not really any way to be punished for that. It's not like you're, losing out on anything by pondering, or excuse me, portenting on the first turn. So it can help set up your mana, make sure that all goes very smoothly, which is very important as well. Portent, important. Sorry, that wasn't on purpose. As well as it just being good at filtering your draws and stuff in the mid game. Impulse, this one is not, I think, required or anything like that. Sometimes people play a couple FOFs or whatever, and this might need to be something like Sleight of Hand or whatever. But I like the additional selection or whatever to be able to find our few threats that we have. Um, but again, this could be something like sleight of hand, which is a little bit better at. Well, obviously, it's castable on turn one. It's 1 mana versus 2, so that is something to think about. But Impulse is also very good at digging deep to find our sideboard cards, which is pretty nice, because we have some haymakers in there, and drawing into those is certainly pretty sweet. So yeah, there you go. That's the long and the short of it. All right, and now there's a ton of different options. Some are more standard than others. Obviously, things like Cloud of Fairies and Spiketail Hatchling, uh, I just love these cards. I haven't seen them in any of the decks, but I would try and test these out at some point because I just love playing them. Although they are rather low impact, and they do screw with our sideboard plan of bringing in things like Pyroclasm, which these cards are obviously very anti-synergistic with. Doesn't work very well. Of course, Grim Lavamancer is another one that's good as a 1 or 2 of, just as additional removal against a lot of these creature-heavy decks. I mean, again, you know the deal: goblins, sly, elves, all this stuff, zombies, all that stuff. Grim Lawmancer, great. Just eats them up. Is an additional attacker, can do all sorts of sweet things. Mother of Runes is one that's played, and like I don't hate it. It is a pretty sweet card, but it is good. For example, like turn one Mom and like turn two Meddling Mage. That does give you a lot of, so it's a very powerful addition to Meddling Mage because it stops, your opponent from killing it or whatever. And that's mostly important in the matches where Meddling Mage is a hammer. So think of like combo decks where naming their combo piece or whatnot with Meddling Mage and then being backed up from things like Chain of Vapor or whatever random removal. With Mother Runes, that's pretty great. Versus a lot of other decks, control decks and things like that, your mileage may vary, right? They can have ways to sidestep it, like Humility. Having a bunch of creatures out isn't good against decks like Oath. And so yeah, I mean it depends. It depends. But it's also like a really wonky draw, like in the mid game, where it's just kind of like, okay, like they kill my creature, and then like I draw into Mother Runes. It's really pretty weak there, so it's not exactly a great draw all the time, and so that's why I'm not a huge fan of Mother of Runes in the deck. Like it seems like it would work, but I mean this kind of thing is too finicky. Its value is too variable, so I'm not a big fan of Mother of Runes. What I do like though is Goblin Trenches, like as a one of to search for either with an Enlightened Tutor package or something like that in the sideboard, or just as a one of in the main deck or something, because it's so good against a lot of the control decks and even mid-range decks. Just being able to have that steady stream of attackers is just awesome, just very sweet. And of course, it being an enchantment makes it more difficult to remove, so it makes you a little bit more resilient to removal. So Trenches, very sweet card. Certainly one of my pet cards, but I think it's actually legitimately good here, and it does serve a sweet purpose. Arcane Lab in the sideboard would be pretty nice if you expected stuff like Alurin or any sort of like the Frantic Storm deck, that kind of thing. Again, not exactly super needed, but it is an option. Fact or Fiction. This card is sweet. Playing a couple copies main deck is pretty cool to reload in the mid game. It has good synergy with Grim Lavamancer too, so that's something to think about. And yeah, just lets you draw some more cards. Although 4 mana is a lot, but the deck has a pretty low curve, so that's something to look into playing. Again, some people have played it. And I think, like I said, I think the theory of playing it is fine. Like, it's okay as a couple copies, but this isn't really a control deck. Using this to reload mid-game is nice, but I don't think it's certainly required. And of course, we have Memory Lapse. Now, this is a sweet card. It is sometimes played in addition to Predict, right? So you can lapse the card on top of their library, then you can predict it, name it with Predict, and then draw some cards and mill the card so they don't get to recast it. So that's kind of neat. Memory Lapse can just be played in addition to Mana Leak. So instead of like the Prohibit, you can play Memory Lapse. Lapse, of course, is a little bit weaker versus the aggressive decks with cheap threats. It's a little wonky there, a little weak there. But again, it is another option. Dwarven Blast Miner. This card is sweet. This is mostly for multicolor decks. Anything with a bunch of important um, utility lands, things like Mishra's Factories and Wastelands and Dust Bowls and so on. Mostly against slower decks, obviously. But yeah, Dwarven Blast Miner, super sweet. I again prefer Armageddon, but I love Dwarven Blast Miner, and it even can be a 3-mana 2/2, and they'll like aim the removal at it and be like, oh, it's just a Dwarven Blast Miner, not an Exalted Angel. You chose wrong, or maybe right. I don't know. But Blast Miner is another sweet option. And last but not least, Stone Rain. This one I would like to do just because it's just another powerful spell. It can set your opponent back a turn. It's easier to cast than something like Pillage, of course, only having like 1 red mana in the symbol. So it's pretty sweet there. Could be an interesting option to try out. That'd be one I'd like to play. A big fan of destroying lands, of course, and for a sort of tempo style aggro control deck, sending your opponent back a land, buying you an extra attack step, rewinding the game a turn, good synergy with something like Memory Lapse, obviously with Mana Leak as well, increasing Mana Leak's value throughout the game, or longer period of time it's live throughout the game is pretty sweet, even though obviously tapping out for 3-minute sorceries can make it difficult to hold up Mana Leak itself. But it's an interesting card. It's something I'd probably like to mess around with at some point. But there's a lot of other options. There's so many other options to mess around with. So yeah, pretty cool. Pretty cool. All right. There are, again, a couple weaknesses of this deck, and it's obviously the mana base. Pretty obvious here. Price of Progress, Wasteland, Port, just mana denial in general. And of course, a lot of your lands are going to deal you a whole bunch of damage. So that's not great. That's not the best. But to mitigate that, of course, there are no double color spells, sans the Exalted Angel. But Exalted Angel gains you life, which does make the painful mana base a little less painful. Yeah, so there is that. There is that. And there unfortunately isn't a lot of card advantage, although this is fairly typical of most aggro control decks. Just in general, they typically don't have access to a lot of card advantage. Again, you can play a couple Foffs or something, or even stuff like, say, Grim Lavamancer, right, against certain decks. Those are pretty sweet, pretty powerful cards that do give you some amount of card advantage. But yeah, so that can be an issue if people are just trying to 1-for-1 you to death. Not great, not great. But you do have a pretty sweet sideboard. There's a ton of different things you can play, and like I said, you can run like an Enlightened Tutor sideboard, which is always sweet. All sorts of really sweet cards like Serenity or Winter Orb, right? In addition to like Armageddon or something. But that's something I'd really want to do if I knew exactly what I was up against. But yeah, I think that the main deck's pretty good. I like having just a bunch of removal. The main deck counter spells about being 6 to 8 I think would be pretty sweet, but having 6 is fine. I think the 10 creatures minimum is pretty good. I might want to play something else in addition, maybe like a fledgling dragon or something as a one of. Just playing just a few more creatures, 1 or 2 more creatures would be nice. But I haven't settled on anything in particular. But yeah, there's a lot of options here, a lot of stuff you can do. But yeah, that's it. That's it. This is a fairly typical kind of aggro control deck. Again, we're not really breaking the mold here. It's just play all the best removal and counter magic and stuff. Play the best creatures, and go from there. Go from there. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Nothing too interesting to say here. Powerful, proactive deck with good answers to a lot of different things. A great sideboard, right? Lots of different options there. Really powerful cards. Being able to play both elemental blasts is great. Some unfortunate weaknesses, of course, due to LD, as well as aggressive decks, depending, you know. Um, so yeah, there you go, there you go. So that's it for today, guys. So thanks for stopping by, and have a great day.